What if I told you I signed you up for a chess tournament 3 months from now? You're playing this guy, 10-minute games, you win, you get 10k. How would you prepare? In almost every respect, that's exactly like what test taking is like. It's a game of strategy, just like chess. And using this chess analogy today, I'm going to show you a couple ways you can improve your test scores and some of the mistakes you might be making in a different context. Now, first of all, I've been taking school tests and standardized tests for the last almost 10 years at this point. I've gotten full scores on my SAT subject tests, 1580 on the SAT, 99 plus percentile on the MCAT. I'm doing, I'd say, pretty well in medical school, so those are just my test taking qualifications, just so you don't think that this is some random ass guy on YouTube. I've also tutored for over 5 years. I've been a part of 1 or 2 prep classes, so I know that a lot of what I talk about and what I'm going to talk about in today's video, they don't really teach you there. And I also got 4th place once in a middle school chess tournament, so those are my qualifications to talk about chess today. Now, I'm not saying this to brag. I'm more just saying this just so you know I'm not some random YouTube guy, even though I am just some random YouTube guy, and I have a little bit of credibility to what I'm about to say today. Now, I know that test taking is a skill and every single test is different, but today we're going to talk a little bit more about what it takes to get a feel for a test. And I know that sounds like BS, a little bit like fake news, but it's not, and trust me. Now, this video is going to be split into 2 parts just because there's so much to cover and I want to cover it well. Today's video is going to be about content review and actually doing those practice exams. So it's going to be about the prep stage, and the next video is going to be about actual test taking strategies for exam day, how to choose between questions when you're 50-50, and just more test taking strategy in general. So once again, a lot of this video will be about test taking prep. Now, this video is brought to you by Shortform. Now, when I first started medical school, the top doctor gave his list of advice of what to do to be successful. And he said, study 8 hours a day, exercise an hour a day, and read an hour a day. Now, if you're trying to get more into reading but incredibly busy, Shortform is an excellent way to ease yourself into that process and figure out which books you like in the meanwhile. It offers the best in-depth summaries of over 1,000 books that you would want to read. Not only are there shorter one-page summaries, there are also more in-depth chapter-by-chapter summaries with all the relevant information and even additional commentary. Like with this book, Talking to Strangers, the short-form summary can still capture a lot of the storytelling aspects that make reading interesting that you lose out on with other summaries. Now check out my link in the bio for 20% off an annual subscription and try out Shortform 5 days for free today and see if you like it. Now back to the video. Now, let's get back into that chess analogy. I tell you I signed you up for that tournament. What's the first thing you do? Now, first thing you do is probably scope out your opponent and also learn the rules about the tournament a little bit. So you have a 10-minute, you're playing a 10-minute game, you bring your own clock, touch rule, yada yada, you know what I mean, just find out the rules of the tournament. And the next thing you do is you scope out your opponent. So your opponent is an 1800 rated player. You get access to maybe 10 of their past games through some chess.com archive or whatever. And that should be okay for now. Now, test taking is the same thing. What you want to do is first find out the rules of the test you're going to take. How many questions are there in a section? How is it scored? How is it curved? How many questions can you get wrong to get the score that you want? What is the scope of the material covered? This is helpful for you to make a test taking strategy, a study strategy, and a guessing strategy. You could probably do all of this in less than a day. For example, it's helpful to know that the scope of the MCAT does not extend to math, so you don't have to pull out your old calc textbook before you start studying for the MCAT. Now, ironically enough, even though probably 80% of how you do on the test is dependent on how much content you know, and much less so is on how good you are at taking a test, the amount of time you want to spend on actual content review is probably only around 25% of the time, and probably around 70% of the time to be spent on doing practice and practice problems. If we think about this in chess terms, the person who knows more chess strategy is probably going to be the one that wins. But the person that spends more of his time practicing putting that strategy into place rather than just studying it on a piece of paper is probably the one that will win the game. Sort of the same gist here if you get my point. Now, this is why most study courses you pay for emphasize content so much, because they don't have to do a lot of work to quickly raise your score 50%. So for content, what do you do? In chess, what you would do is find a couple openings and become really confident and very, very fluent in those openings. And then you slowly move out a little bit and expose yourself to more openings, right? And that's just because you don't want to fall for something dumb. You don't want to know openings really well and then get 4-move checkmated, right? So the same thing applies for taking tests, right? You want to focus on the really high yield content first, and then spread out a little bit and be familiar with the lower yield content. Now, you can normally determine what is high yield content, first of all, by looking at Reddit, but next of all, just looking at overlap between the different resources you have, and the things that overlap the most will be the most high yield. For example, if we're taking the MCAT, every single resource and every single class I've ever taken went over amino acids over and over and over. So you know that amino acids, and knowing those super well, are incredibly high yield, versus something that might be discrete in physiology would be slightly lower yield on the MCAT. And it won't be necessarily covered in the same amount of detail in every single book. For lower yield topics, all you have to do is probably watch a YouTube video and you can get enough of the gist that you need. Now remember, in this chess analogy, we're all still just beginners. I know you have 10 minutes in this game for the tournament. You finish studying some of the common openings and a little bit of the adjacent strategies and things like that. Now it's time to put that to practice. But your initial practice should be untimed, just to get familiar with putting these openings into practice and actually playing a little bit more chess. The thinking is, not only do you want to get more familiar with the rhythm and the flow, you also want to see what level you play at when you have no pressure, no external pressures, no time pressure, and none of the other stuff. You play your first few games of chess, applying what you learn when you're studying, and you see how you do. And that's probably the same approach you want to take when you're doing practice questions or practice exams. The first few untimed. Now, when considering practice resources, anything that comes from the official test makers will be the optimal resources to go off of, but honestly, it's very unlikely that any third-party resource is going to be easier than the official resources. They're only going to be harder, but you want to pick the third-party resource that is closest to the level difficulty of the exam you're going to take, and not one that's notoriously much harder. I feel like some people are in the mindset that when you pick a much more difficult thing, if you can do those problems, then you can also do easier problems. But sometimes that has you thinking at a different wavelength and using different logic than what the official test maker wants you to think like. But you also want to leave those official resources to the end of your prep. Now imagine you had 5 scrimmages that you're allowed to play with your opponent in this chess analogy, right? Would you want to play it in the beginning before you know anything and you can't really understand what your opponent's playstyle is like? Or you want to play after you've done all your prep and you feel like you're confident, and then after playing your opponent, you could see how you could tweak based off of his actual playstyle. So just like in chess, if you have no time pressure, you know precisely what it is the mistakes that are coming on your exams are from. Now, after doing questions untimed, there's only 2 possible reasons that you could be getting your questions wrong. One is you just don't know enough content, and 2 is your systematic test-taking strategy is ineffective, in part meaning that you don't understand the logic of the test well enough. Now, previously I said to only study the high yield topics and a little bit of what's adjacent during your dedicated content review. Well, you might be thinking, well, everything is high yield. What should I study? Everything is covered on this test, right? Do I just need to be like a chess grandmaster in this analogy or something, like know everything? But think about how grandmasters got to where they were. They started just with a couple openings that they were really comfortable at. They played a bunch of games, and one day they saw the opponent using something that they were unfamiliar with, and they might have lost, and they're like, damn, I need to go back and study that. So they studied it, added that to things they were familiar with. Same thing happened a couple of days later. They saw something they were unfamiliar with, they were like, damn, I need to study that too. And eventually, they just became comfortable with a lot of topics. And it's the same thing with test taking. When you're first approaching content, it's easier to build on that content you know if you have a really strong foundation in the fundamentals, right? You want to focus on the really high yield topics, that way you can quickly get to practicing. But anything you see in a practice problem that you're unfamiliar with is fair game to be on the actual exam. So that's the stuff that you should be supplementing your studying with after you see it in your practice problems and get those wrong. It's through the practice questions and reviewing them that you learn the lower yield material and decide if they're worth learning. The more practice you do, you learn, the more material you learn. That way you don't have to waste your time on things that might never show up. Anything that you get wrong and you see and you study will be fair game for the exam. Now if you find yourself getting questions wrong by bad 50-50 choosing, this is like if you know the opening your opponent's going to play and you still lose. You need to start coming up with a more systematic approach to how you are taking your test. Take some time to look at all the questions I'm about to ask. 1. What are the things you're looking for when you're reading the question? For example, is the important part of the question normally just at the end, or do I have to read the whole thing? Which directions are the answers leaning towards? Are most of the answer choices pointing towards one line of logic or a different line of logic? Do you have something built in your system to be thinking about exceptions when you're doing problems? And how do you actually pick between questions that you're 50-50 on? Now, the biggest switch in my head when it came to test taking and what helped me develop what I would call a gut feeling is when I started doing these two things. 1, when I was doing questions untimed, every single question answer choice in the beginning, I'd read the entire thing and ask, why do I think the exam writer included this as an answer choice? Why do I think the exam writer worded it the way he or she worded it? And then after I looked at the answer choices, I would think, why is this choice better than all the other answer choices? And even though this is the right answer, why did the exam writer choose to word it in this way? And the second thing is I created a system of just checklists of things I would do every single practice exam, the order of things that I would look for. For the SAT, this checklist was MP, NP, TP. Main point, negative, positive, transitions and pronouns. And for the MCAT, this checklist was name, function, question, exception. I'm not going to go too much in depth of what that means. Now, it represents a workflow for every single question that you do. At first, this is going to take way too much time. You're going to be doing your practice tests on time. You're going to be like, there's no way I'm going to manage this if I'm doing this on the actual exam. But the thing is, after you do this, you get a sense for how the exam writer is actually writing their question. These things become things that you can point out instantly, and you sort of calibrate your gut feeling to how the exam writer is trying to write their questions. Now, I chose the chess analogy for a reason. It's because everyone has their own style of play in chess. The right move in certain positions might be different depending on who you're playing in chess, and that's the same thing with test take. Eventually, you start getting an idea of how your test maker asks their questions, why the test maker likes certain choices even when you might think they're wrong, what the style and the scope of the test is. Are you overthinking, or is the test actually just really difficult? Or vice versa, are you oversimplifying how difficult the test actually is? And let me tell you, picking choices based off of how you've started to interpret the test taker likes asking questions can feel super wrong. It can feel super wrong. Sometimes if I were to look purely at the words on the page, I would pick a certain answer. But after seeing so many times that the test maker likes to have this certain type of answer choice be the right answer, I switch my answer from what seems like it's right on paper and pick the one I think the test maker is trying to lead me towards. And more often than not, that leads me to the right answer. This is what helps you get those extra points, raise your score from an 80 to a 95 or something like that, right? And this workflow of how you should be looking at your practice tests and things like that when you're doing them untimed is the most important thing you can take from this video. If you're taking a prep course and the course is good, all that means is that in addition to teaching content, the teacher is giving you their systematic approach to taking the tests. And they tell you how they've started to interpret the logic of the test writer. But this is stuff you can do on your own, and you become even better at it if you come up with it on your own. Now, after that is when you start adding time practice back into the entire thing, and you start doing entire practice tests, full-length practice tests, doing them timed. But because of your intentional practice of looking for the right thing, you can actually streamline that entire process. And you can start doing entire tests way faster than other people are doing them and be doing better than they're doing. It's just like how if you're a chess grandmaster who's spent like hours and hours analyzing games and seeing why people make a move in preparation for a move that's going to be 5 moves away or something like that, right? After doing all that preparation and doing all that studying that took a lot of time originally, now they can play a speed game and beat you when they only have 1 minute on the clock and you have 10. And that's the important thing about, this is why this method of first untimed practice of very deep analysis of the questions is what will bring your score from 80 to a 100. Now, the last tip I'll leave for this section, just to make it a little bit broader, is just I found that the more people that have to take a test, like the SAT, everyone in the country has to take that test, the more intentional the writer will be with the wording, and the more subtleties in the wording will change your answer from being right to wrong. Versus a test that your teacher writes, or a test that's just in medical school or just in even the MCAT. The less people that have to take a test, the more the subtleties of the wording stop mattering, and you might really hate an answer choice, but it could still be the right one just because the teacher or the writer was trying to point you towards a certain route of logic. Now, once again, this is how I believe you should be approaching prep for test taking. In the next video, we're going to be talking about actual test taking strategies for when you're taking the test, including timing, picking between 50-50, and other test taking strategies that I use. Now, if you like the video, leave a comment down below, like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.